Thank you everyone for joining us again this week on a special hangout, and special thank you last week to those of you who tuned in. We had a really good time, didn't we? Talking about sexuality and evangelism. And if you want to see that, actually just head on back to youtube.com/special hangout. Last week's is posted now. So thank you. And I realized as I was watching last week's again, I didn't really say anything about myself last week. So this week I just wanted to say yesterday was my day off, and I had a great cup of coffee. So with that, I wanted to show you guys the building that that I'm trying to raise money for. This was born out of a fundraiser, if you weren't here last week to hear that. And essentially, we bought a building that is from 1908, and I got a picture of it actually this time. Here it is, our wonderful building. It is very old, but it's pretty beautiful. You can see the stained glass windows on the outside and the nice old looking doors. And by the way, with this, I wanted to say this is in no way affiliated officially with my church. I love my church, and I just want to raise some money for our building because we've got pretty massive deficit. But on the outside, very pretty. On the inside, it's very 1908. Caskets and all, skeletons, snakes. Okay, not really, but the link that I gave you guys last week too was wrong, and I apologize. It's actually marshill.com/give. If you went looking to donate, you probably got a 404 error, and I know you can't donate to a 404 error, but this week I'm giving you the right link. So please, if you do donate, only give $1. That's the rule, and we will take care of the rest. So thank you for that. And this week we have we are very blessed to have a guest who is just a treasure chest of knowledge. And he has a national radio show here. I have a lot of things to show you about him. Hold on. Let's see. I had it queued here. Well, I'll have to scrap it for now. But he is Dr. Michael Brown, and if I tried to read his entire CV to you guys, we would have an entire show of just his CV. Here we go. So he is the author of several books, which I have here on the screen, and I will reveal him too. He has books: The Real Kosher Jesus, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, A Queer Thing Happened to America, Revolution, A Call to Holy War, Go and Sin No More, A Call to Holiness, High Voltage Christianity, which I don't have a picture of that one here, but that is a book that he wrote. And he is currently the, I believe, Denver Theological Seminary adjunct professor in Messianic Jewish Studies. And he has a national radio show, which is on Monday through Friday from 2 p.m. Eastern to 4 p.m. Eastern. So if you're on the West Coast, and a lot of you watching probably are, you should probably podcast, because over here the times just get real hard. So let me pull him up here on screen and give him a nice round of applause. Welcome. So we'll just roll right into it. Dr. Brown, the issue we'll be talking about here is just, I titled it The Real Kosher Christian because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings that we have as Christians as our relationship to the Jewish people. So I wanted to start by asking you, so as the Bible would have it, just generally, God creates the world, Adam sins, a lot of stuff happens, Jesus is born, does a lot of cool miracles, claims to be God and that we should worship him, dies, is resurrected, vindicating him as God. Some people become Christians, some don't and stay Jews. Christians move forward with the good news to share. Judaism, though giving birth to Christianity, is now just another false religion. Is there anything wrong with that description? Ooh.
Okay, did I just unmute
That's
myself?
okay. Yep. Yeah. There you go. I was wondering if that was me.
Yeah, you had muted me, and I was
I'm
trying to tell
sorry.
you you had muted me, and
I am
then
so sorry.
since I'm not proficient in ministering to the deaf. I didn't know how to. You had muted
I'm
me.
sorry.
Um,
My fault.
yeah, but good to be with you, and thanks for the rousing round of applause for the millions of viewers here. I just have to say one thing, that when you go back and look at this, you're gonna get a kick out of how your building looked, because it looks great, except it has your hair coming up on the top. So go back and look at that. Don't edit it, because it
I
looks cool.
won't. Well, that's the way it looks, man. That's the way the building looks.
Yeah, it gives more of a personal touch and shows that you guys really need funds. Yeah, aside from leaving out a lot of the story in
Sure.
terms of God calling Israel and God sending the Messiah through the people of Israel, the notion that some people became Christians, the Jews did not, and now Judaism is just another false religion is obviously grossly overstated, as you intended it to be, and really cuts out a major part of the story. So if we stop and think about this a bit, we see that through history, God would work through people or with nations, all with his one great goal of bringing a people to himself from every nation, kindred, tongue. So we know God's heart for the whole world. We know that God does not racially or ethnically discriminate. He wants to bless the whole world, but in order to do that, he works through individuals or groups or nations. So when the whole world is sinned in Genesis 6, and he's got to bring destruction, he finds Noah. And through Noah and his seed, the earth is repopulated. Then after the Tower of Babel, Genesis 11, the end of the 11th chapter, God chooses Abram. Why? Abram listened to him, believed in him, so he found someone that he could work with and set his love on that one. He calls him in Isaiah 41, he makes reference to Abraham, his friend. So Abraham was someone who really trusted the Lord and thereby pleased the Lord. So God made promises to Abraham that through his seed, the whole world would be blessed. So it's important we understand why God started this and how he works with Israel. It wasn't because the people of Israel were better than anyone else. In fact, when you read the Old Testament, you see they're actually just like everybody else. It's kind of a picture of fallen humanity there. And he says in Deuteronomy 7, I didn't choose you because you were better or big or anything, but because I love the fathers. So he made promises to Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. Why? Because he wanted to bless the whole world. He wanted to send the Messiah, but he had to send the Messiah in an environment where he could be born and raised in an environment that knew and worshiped God, and where there were people who actually understood what sin was, what holiness was, what sacrifice and atonement were. If we think about it, if Jesus came 2,000 years ago and died and rose from the dead in India, we wouldn't be saved today. You say, how's that? It's the same blood. Exactly. But there was no people there to receive the message and understand it. He would have just been another in the pantheon of gods, or maybe another incarnation of Krishna who worked miracles and died and ascended to heaven. But there would have been no understanding of sin, of atonement, of the one true God. So that's why God had a people called Israel, so he could train them, teach them, equip them. It was like a 2,000-year process to get them ready for the coming of the Messiah. And then when he came into the world, Galatians 4, he came as a Jew born under the law to redeem those who are under the law, and then to bring redemption to the whole world. So the idea of Jews going on with their religion and other people becoming Christians, that doesn't work initially because there's no such thing as Christian. You don't find any reference to it until Acts the 11th chapter. Then you find it again in Acts 26 and then in 1 Peter 4. So the term is only mentioned 3 times, and it did not define people from another religion. It was apparently, most scholars believe, a mocking title or description that was given to the first followers of Jesus, Jews and Gentiles together, these Christ ones. It would be like mocking people that look to me, the Brownites or something like that. Apparently, how it was used. And it was Jews and Gentiles. And in fact, nobody ever questioned that the first Jews were still Jews. In fact, when Saul of Tarsus was persecuting others, people say, yeah, well, Saul was persecuting Christians, and then Saul got saved, and he became a Christian and changed his name to Paul. No. Saul was persecuting fellow Jews. There was no such thing as a Christian yet at that time. The designation hadn't been given yet. He was persecuting fellow Jews who believed in Jesus. Then he too became a believer in Jesus the Messiah and continued to live as a Jew, not relying on his traditions or his background or his observance, relying fully in Jesus Yeshua. But he didn't convert to another religion. And the other thing that's noteworthy is that from birth, as a Jew born in the Greek city, he would have been known as both Saul and Paul. He would have had the Hebrew name Shaul. He would have had the Greek name Paulus. Some even say he would have had a third Latin name. So after he comes to faith in the Messiah in Acts 9, he's still called Saul. And he's called Saul right up through the beginning of Acts 13. And when he's sent on his mission to the Gentiles, he's called Paul because that's who he's relating to. So it's not Saul, Jewish, bad. Paul, Christian, good.
Sure.
So that dichotomy is a wrong one. And the first Jews understood that they were Jews who had embraced the Messiah of Israel. So we understand a religion called Christianity has been birthed and it is distinct from Judaism. But when we make this giant separation, we exaggerate spiritual realities, we exaggerate history, and we fail to recognize that God still has promises to Israel that remain intact.
And in saying that, would you say that that kind of affects our attitudes if we as Christians don't see the connection of, I don't know if this is the right word, but our spiritual heritage being rooted in the Jewish faith, properly understood, I suppose, if that makes sense?
Yes, certainly. Paul addresses it in Romans, the 11th chapter. Now, I want to be clear. There is no spiritual superiority in being Jewish. Our spirituality comes from our relationship with God through Jesus. And in terms of access to salvation, there's no difference between Jew and Greek. Paul lays that out in Romans, the 10th chapter. The same Lord is Lord of all, richly answering all those who call upon him. The issue is this. Paul addresses it in Romans, the 11th chapter, writing to Gentile believers in Rome, which was the bulk of the Roman congregation, the Roman church. He doesn't say, now you're all spiritual Israel. I'm calling you spiritual Jews. No, that was the perfect place. He says, I'm writing to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I'm the apostle to the Gentiles. I make much of my ministry. I want you, by your connection to the God of Israel, to provoke the Jewish people to envy. And then he says, don't become arrogant. In other words, don't say, well, Jewish branches were broken off from the tree, so I could be grafted in. He said, true. Mm-hmm. He said, you stand by faith. They were cut off because of unbelief. He said, but look at the kindness and severity of God. Kindness towards you who believe, severity towards those who follow. He said, but you will also be cut off if you become arrogant. And then later, in Romans 11:25, it says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you become arrogant. I read a book a few years ago by a popular Christian teacher. He said, if Paul called it a mystery, it's a mystery to me. No. The Greek word mystery there means something that's previously been hidden that's now revealed. He says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you become arrogant. Ignorance will lead to arrogance. And then he says, hardness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in, then all Israel will be saved. So there'll be a final national turning at the end. But what's his point? What's his warning there? If the Gentile believer said, God's finished with Israel, we are the new Israel, we have replaced Israel, we are the new kids on the block, we moved into their beautiful home, they're now out on the street. There is a lack of recognition of history, of dependence. Paul says, you don't support, he says the root supports you. You don't support the root. So there's that arrogance. We are the new people. We now stand. God's finished with those miserable Jews. We are the new Israel. And through church history, as that has happened, you see the beginning of what's called supersessionism, that the church has superseded Israel, or replacement theology. Mm-hmm. You see it through history. And by the time you get to the 3rd, 4th centuries, it's developed into blatant, outright anti-Semitism, mm-hmm. and then paves the way for Jew hatred and persecution of the Jews through history. So even though there are people today who hold to replacement theology, who are not anti-Semitic in any way, who love Jewish people and who don't have an anti-Semitic bone in their body, it's a wrong theology. It makes us build the second floor of the house before we built the first floor, mm-hmm. or actually forget about the first floor, just cut that off. And then secondly, it opens the door to potential hostility to Israel.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm glad you said that, because so when I was in 8th grade, we had to watch a video called Roots. I don't know if they still do that, and I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's got that guy from Star Trek in it. I can only remember his Star Trek name for some reason, but it's a movie about slavery. And the school I went to, I was the only black kid in the class, and there was a couple other minorities in the class, but it was mostly white kids in the class. And so when we're on a certain chapter, at the end of the episode, Kunta Kinte, the main character, he tries to run away, and then if I recall correctly, like he gets beat, and it's a very emotionally tense scene, especially for a lot of eighth graders to watch. And um, so the video's over, and then all of a sudden, everyone just turns to me in the classroom. And as a child, I'm knowing like you guys, you're not responsible for this, so I'm not holding this against you. But everyone turns to me, and the teacher, just doing whatever she can. She goes, "Are you okay?" And I kind of laughed just because it was so foreign to me, even though I understand her intention in saying that. And I guess the reason why I tell that story is because I think similarly we have that history as Christians as far as in persecution of Jewish people, and some of the writings of Martin Luther that have been real terrible, stuff like that. Do we as Christians, are we the proverbial white children in that classroom looking at me, who would be the Jewish people, if that makes sense?
Hmm. Yeah, well, let me answer this on a few levels. First, of course, everyone in my generation is familiar with Roots. I'm probably the people that never saw it, though, but I know it was a classic.
Yeah, it's a good
Uh,
movie, yeah.
yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of moving stuff to it, and I'm familiar with the history enough.
Yeah,
But no, I didn't see the movie, but of course, everybody knows about it.
yeah.
But I've had Christians come up to me sometimes after reading my book, Our Hands Are Stained with Blood, for example. And I've had Christians sometimes lined up to talk to me, weeping and crying, saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so terribly sorry."
Mm,
Because they feel a certain sense of identification with church history, especially if they're European Christians, because this is primarily an Anglo phenomenon.
yeah.
This is not something that happens, say, in African Christianity or Indian Christianity or Chinese Christianity, at least not on any of these kinds of levels.
Hmm.
And of course, it's a special thing just for them to say that, and for me to extend grace to them on a personal level. Of course, it's the last thing in my mind to ever think of towards others.
Yeah.
On my end, I've been in the Lord now for 41 years, and everywhere I've gone around the world, I've found terrific love for the Jewish people in the church. I've wished I could take rabbis with me around the world to see the love that God supernaturally put in the hearts of Christians for the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But here's why it's a contemporary issue that we need to think about. My view of things that happened in the past, as far as fixing them, or reconciliation, or repentance, whatever, is that if the damage remains, or if the wound is still open, in other words, the thing is still going on, it
Yeah.
needs to be addressed. So let's just say you are the richest man in your state, okay? But I discover that 35 generations ago, one of my uncles stole the last dime from one of your cousins. I don't feel like I now have to go to you and say, "Hey, I discovered this really weighing on me. Will you please forgive me?" And
Yeah.
you're like, "What are you talking about?" However, if I was still stealing from you and your family, and my great grandfather had stolen your great grandfather's inheritance, because of which your family's been hurting ever since, now it's something I have to address. So
Hmm.
here's why this is still a relevant issue. Replacement theology is alive and well, and it often opens the door to hostility towards modern Israel. In
Mm.
other words, many of the people who turn against Israel, who call Israel an evil occupier, who demonize Israel, who basically blindly side with the Palestinian cause, as if Israel is the evil giant in the region and the Palestinians are helpless, all godly, nice people. They'll often have a replacement theology that fuels things. Because, see, if they realize it's God who scattered Israel, it's God who regathered Israel. If God scatters, no one can regather. He said, "I'll scatter you in my judgment, I'll regather you in my mercy." If God has regathered Israel, if the church has historically often sinned against Israel and the Jewish people, the Crusades and Inquisitions
Yeah.
and dimensions of what paved the way for the Holocaust tie in with that. So if that's been the case, and now we recognize that God has preserved my people, yes, still under judgment, the only way of salvation is through Jesus Yeshua. We understand that. So I grieve over lost generations of my people. I don't glorify it and somehow think that God gave them a special way in.
Yeah.
But if we recognize God has scattered the Jewish people, supernaturally preserved the Jewish people, now brought them back into the land, And prophecies like Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 14 speak of a day when there'll be universal attack, worldwide hostility towards Israel. We recognize spiritual dimensions and we say, okay, if Israel does wrong, we need to confront Israel. Jewish people are still sinners like everyone else. They need the Messiah. Palestinians deserve justice like anyone else, but we will not blindly demonize Israel.
Sure.
And we will tend to recognize the spiritual dimensions of what's happening and read between the lines of the news as well. And not only so, replacement theology, by severing itself from its biblical roots, not only produced a spiritual pride, but certain aspects of spiritual error. For example, when people can be, quote, so heavenly minded that they're of no earthly good, it should be that the more heavenly minded we are, the more earthly good we are. But they make everything so ethereal and so spiritual and so on, that often that happens because Jewish roots are cut off. Because if you had more of a biblically based understanding and one that did not sever itself from the Old Testament, you'd realize the importance of life.
Uh-oh. Can you still hear me? Sorry. All right.
Yeah,
it froze for a second.
Froze for a second there.
You're good.
Yeah, but say, for example, we can make the kingdom of God so ethereal, so otherworldly. That only happens when we break away from a Jewish background and context to the Gospels and the New Testament. I shouldn't say it only happens that way, but that's often.
Yeah, that's right.
The fact that some branches of the church have iconography, the statues and the idols, that would never have happened if the church had more rightly connected with its Jewish roots. Sometimes the exaltation of single people, the one-man show, as opposed to team ministry and recognizing the importance of elders, plural and stuff, a lot of that comes from just a different context of leadership, which is a pagan context versus Jewish, to put it in exaggerated terms.
Yeah.
So there are ongoing implications. Therefore, it's important to seize these things and fix them. Not because you have to go back and say, I discovered 48 generations back, there was an uncle's cousin's sister who knew someone that was in the crusade, so I have to apologize to you. That stuff's just silly. Nor is it helpful when Christians think the right thing to do is become Jews. So now what you're going to do is you're going to start dressing up like a Jew. Hey, you got that beard? I know blacks don't have his curly hair, but side comes from maybe. And even the Pope has that. That doesn't help either. Gentile Christians think if they dress up like Jews, they're going to now fix this.
Sure.
It's a matter of a spiritual recognition for ongoing spiritual good.
Sure. And I know there are a lot of Christians that do support, I'm glad you said that do support and stand with Israel. But there's that, and then at the same time, kind of like you echoed, there's just like a husk of just indifference or just ignorance, which would obviously lead to indifference. And this even shows up in our Bible translations, or the way it's written out, with like the names of certain books and certain people in the books. Could you kind of explain that?
Sure thing. Yeah, let's look at names first. Let's first recognize that names carry associations. When I mention, certain names, if I say Michael Jordan, everyone thinks basketball. If I say Albert Einstein, people think genius. If I say Adolf Hitler, they think, villainous murderer and tyrant and stuff. So names do carry certain associations. When I speak of Jesus Christ, son of the Virgin Mary, it doesn't sound particularly Jewish. It sounds Catholic if you had a thing.
Sure.
If I spoke of Yeshua the Messiah, son of the Virgin Miriam, people wonder, well, what religion is that? What are you talking about? So simple things like names make a big deal, make a big difference. So let's think about Jacob, all right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Hebrew, it's Yaakov. In Greek, it comes out as Jacobus. So there's no question what the Greek actually says. And if you'll look in many, many different languages, you'll see a form of Jacob consistently. In Spanish, you'll find Santiago, which at first I thought, how in the world did they get Santiago?
Yeah, I've never heard that, actually.
That's actually a corruption for San Diego, Saint Diego being a corruption of Yaakov.
Wow.
But English has James, and it predates King James. It's already in the Tyndale translation. What happened was that just as often transpires over a period of centuries with languages. Certain words can morph, certain consonants can morph, vowels can morph. So Jacobus in Greek came into Latin in that form. At a certain point in Latin, it morphed into Jacomus, and then through that, some say through French, it came into English ultimately as James. Now here's the problem. The Greek doesn't say James. The Greek says Jesus, so Jesus. That was the Greek way of saying Yeshua. But the Greek way of saying Yaakov, Jacob, was Jacobus. It was still Jacob. So let's think of the difference it makes. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and James. Kind of sounds like we're mixing religions. Versus the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Makes a big difference. Mm-hmm. So when you start thinking that Yeshua had disciples with names like Jacob and Yochanan, and things like that, Yaakov and Yochanan, you start to realize, wow, this gives us much more of a Jewish context. And then the letter of Jacob. Mm-hmm. I'm consistently trying to make that switch. I have for years, but even in things I'm writing on a popular level, to try to make the switch. And I always say Jacob, James, for those that don't know what you're talking about. Let's turn to the letter of Jacob. I'm like, where is that? Like one of those new books they discover? So, letter of Jacob, we call it letter of James. Who's it addressed to? The 12 tribes scattered abroad, meaning Jewish believers scattered all around the world. Now, there's some believers read that. It's like, well, then what do I have left? If that's for the Jews, what's for me? It's like, well, Corinthians wasn't written for Jews, and those two letters, and Romans wasn't, and Galatians wasn't, Ephesians, most of the epistles were not written to Jews. Some were, like this, the letter of Jacob. When you realize it's a letter written by Jacob, the brother of Yeshua, to Jewish believers scattered around the world, and then you read it, it takes on a whole different meaning, and it reminds us again of this Jewish connection. Every time you're reading Acts, when you see James, put Jacob there. Every time you're reading the Gospels, when it makes reference to the apostles by those names, put Jacob there instead. It actually changes the feel of what you're reading. Mm-hmm. What does Christ mean? I've talked to people on the street that say they're Christians. What does Christ mean? They don't know. When you grow up as a Jew, Christ has no meaning to you. Jesus Christ, that's his full name. I'm Michael Brown. He was Jesus Christ. Plenty of Jewish believers, plenty, before they were believers, had the impression that Jesus was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Christ.
Wow, that is so wild to think of.
How are you going to know otherwise,
yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
So when we understand, no, this is Yeshua the Messiah, Christos being the Greek way of saying Mashiach, anointed one, Messiah. The word Christos did not have a lot of meaning in the general Greek world, so as the gospel went out, a lot of the people, especially on the outside, just thought it was a name. Some thought it was Christos. Some referred to the Christians instead of the Christians because they just didn't understand the name. But to a Jew, this was Yeshua, the Messiah. So Christ is a dirty word in many Jewish homes, especially religious Jewish homes. Yeah. I know Jewish believers that it took them a while before they could say Jesus Christ because in their minds, they always heard of this profanity. Mm-hmm. Something that someone uses as a swear word. Mm-hmm. Let's think of one other thing. We can look at the names. We can look at some of the terms involved. Let's think of ecclesia. Ecclesia in the Greek was not a new word, was not something mysterious that Jesus introduced. He introduced new aspects of this, the congregation, the assembly, what we call the church. He introduced new aspects. It would be Jew and Gentile together. It would be birthed in the power of the kingdom of God invading this world. It would have a dimension of fullness of the Spirit and giftedness in the Spirit that no other people had before. So it would be unique in many ways. But when he introduced the concept, it was who was in it that was new and how he would build it that was new, not the concept of ecclesia. This occurs a number of times in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, when they were talking about the Kahal Yisrael, the congregation or assembly of Israel, or Adat Yisrael, the assembly or congregation of Israel, that this was the word ecclesia that was used. So he was speaking originally Hebrew or more likely Aramaic to his disciples. So when he says in Matthew 16, I will build my church, most of our English translations, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it, I've heard preachers say, and it was an entirely new concept they had never heard of before. He said, I will build my... What? What did he say? I will build my... Well, we never heard that. What is that? No, no.
Yeah.
He used a common word. What was new was what he was going to endue it with and who it would be made up of. Now,
Mhm.
here's the problem. In English, when we say church, it means something very non-Jewish, number one, right? The Old
Mhm.
Testament church sounds a little
Mhm.
strange. That's the
Mhm.
first thing. The second thing, it refers to a building and it refers to a people. Just like in Spanish, iglesia, which comes straight from ecclesia. You have the same thing in Italian and some other languages. If you're reading the Bible in German, when you say ecclesia, it says Gemeinde, the community, the congregation. And the word Kirche for a physical building is not in the translations. So the Kirche is the place you go to. The Gemeinde is the community of believers. So if we, in our understanding, associate church with both the people and the place, we tend to put our emphasis on going to church rather than being the church. And if we would just recapture calling it congregation, as William Tyndale did before King James, but the King James translators rejected that and went back to the church terms, we could really help people understand that this is us. That, yeah, buildings are important as buildings because we meet there and we wear them out for the gospel, bringing people in and serving people in the community and all of that, teaching and equipping. But this is another simple little thing with
Mhm.
translation that makes a big difference. And then you have verses like Galatians 6:16, where Paul is talking about a blessing on the Galatians, the Gentile believers there, as well as, he's not writing them off, Jewish believers, whom he calls
Mhm.
the Israel of God. Some, like the NLT, which is a translation slash paraphrase, renders that in such a way that the Galatians are now called the new people of God, and Israel is actually removed entirely.
Wow.
And others render it to give the impression that the Galatians are the new Israel, which would completely undo the whole argument Paul's been making that you
Right.
Gentiles, you don't have to come under the
Right.
law today.
Right.
No, he's blessing peace, mercy upon all who follow this rule, and also upon the Israel of God. We're not writing them off. We're not rejecting Jewish believers. We're just saying you don't need to become Jews. So some translations put a wrong comma in there, or they'll say even rather than and give a misleading impression. So a lot of this matters. It has massive consequences for
Yeah.
the course of centuries.
Yeah. And it's interesting because I don't know. This is funny to me. Maybe no one else will understand it, but it's just in light of everything that you're saying and things that I see, in my Christian circles and stuff. It's interesting that Paul, a Jew, wrote most of the New Testament. But do you think also with a lot of these practical implications, which there are very many, as you are enlightening me to, there can be a distortion of like the law of God? For instance, just through listening to you, I began reading Psalms 119 a lot, and I had no idea that was in the Bible, and that was just a brand new thing to me. But I think I can kind of see because in my own thinking, and praise the Lord that I'm now understanding the right way to think about this. I had so separated the two faiths that I saw the law as sort of something foreign to me, or
Mhm.
not something that I had to live by. I suppose not that I was being disobedient, but my thinking was just out of whack. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and it's very understandable because the New Testament has a lot of strong statements concerning the law that could make one feel hostile to it. And then some of it seems very foreign. So a Christian reads it and all the sacrificial laws and
Hmm.
details of building the tabernacle. You could be reading that, or say Philippians or John. It's like, man, let me read this stuff. It's much more life giving. Or some of the stuff, don't suffer which to live. Putting adulterers to death, and there's a certain harshness to it, the way it seems to many
Yeah.
of us living in the West today. And then Paul speaks about how law brings wrath, or the strength of sin is the law, and by the works of the law no one can be justified. So there are many statements like this, because of which many Christians have overreacted to it. I'm finishing a book now on hyper grace, exposing the errors of the modern grace movement. If
Yeah.
folks follow me at AskDrBrown.org, they can connect Facebook and all other ways there. AskDrBrown.org, and I keep publishing articles on this and just finishing the book actually this week, hopefully getting it off to the publisher. But I have a chapter in the book called "The Law of the Lord is Good," where I recover the positive aspects of what the New Testament says about the law, and then we go back to the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, and recover that. See, when Paul says in 2 Corinthians 3 that the law that was written in tablets of stone was a ministry of death, even though it was glorious, it was a ministry of death. It wasn't that the laws were bad. Paul reinforces in Romans 7 that the law, the commandment, is holy and just and good. What was bad was something written in tablets of stone, something exterior to me, telling me how to live without empowering me to do it. What now happens through the new covenant, Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, is that the law of God and the laws of God are now written on our hearts, so it becomes natural, spiritually natural, to obey him, to keep his laws. Now, it's one thing to say you must obey all the law of Moses in order to be saved. Paul absolutely opposed that with all of his might. It's one thing to say, especially to a Gentile, you will be more spiritual if you go back under the law. No, Paul would oppose that strongly as well in terms of that mentality. But what we need to do is recover with Psalm 119, the beauty and the wonder and the glory and the power of the law. Great peace have those who love your law. Nothing will make them stumble. Psalm 19, the law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing, renewing the soul. There's so many wonderful things that are said. And again, we have this overreaction as if the law itself is bad, negative, as opposed to learn from it, live by it. Jacob tells us that when we show favoritism, we're convicted by the law that we're sinning. So when Paul writes to Timothy in 2 Timothy 3:16 that all scripture is inspired by God and is useful for teaching, correction, and training in righteousness and rebuke, what's he talking about? He's talking about the Old Testament. That was the only scripture that existed at that time as scripture. And he's saying now that all of this is useful. And it's there for the man of God to be thoroughly equipped for every good work, to teach and train and help others. So, yes, we walk in the fullness of the revelation of who Jesus is and what he brought about. Yes, the law was given by Moses. Grace and truth came by Jesus the Messiah. But notice the word "but" is not there in the Greek in John 1:17. It doesn't say the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. No, the law was given by Moses, semicolon, and grace and truth came by Jesus the Messiah. That's why he says in Matthew 5:17-20, I didn't come to abolish the law of the prophets, but to fulfill. So many times it's our attitude towards the law, which either leads to an antinomianism or to a misunderstanding of grace, or, again, lessens our foundations. For example, if you want to understand holiness, read Leviticus. That's where God says several times, Leviticus 19, the most often quoted, be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Now, Peter quotes it in 1 Peter 1. And he doesn't say to his readers, I apologize for quoting this old stuff. I mean, it's bondage and it's negative, but it's the only thing I can use right now, or the only thing I remember. No. For authority, he says, this is what he goes back to. Be holy. God's calling you to be holy in all of your conduct. Why? Because he's holy. So I go back and read Leviticus, not to try to reconstruct the purity laws for today, not to try to figure out what to do with blood sacrifices. Everything about the sacrificial system has reached its fulfillment in Yeshua. Not for those reasons, but to understand the difference between clean and unclean. To understand these things were given to Israel physically, and they can now teach me spiritually. I can learn things, for example, that in the building of the tabernacle, the most holy place was gold. You come out from there, it's silver, and then you come out from there, it's bronze. Or everything in Israel, the animals, you had those that could be offered for sacrifice. They were holy, right? They were without blemish. Then you had those that could be eaten. Then you had those that couldn't be. So you had holy, clean, and unholy. Or the people as a whole. The people of Israel were to be clean before the Lord, right? If you had a violation, you touched a dead body, so you could be unclean, separated from the camp. And then there were those who were set apart for service in the tabernacle who were holy. The priests, the Levites. So you have the same thing again, holy, clean, unholy, or unclean. So everything through the whole nation, God's teaching. And sometimes when I read the specific laws, the ones that could not enter to serve, and down to the smallest blemish, you realize, wow, God really wants us to be pure and spotless through his Son and through living it out. So there's so much to be gained. Many pictures of Jesus the Messiah we get in the law and the prophets that we wouldn't get elsewhere. And we hurt ourselves by neglecting it or having a negative attitude towards it. What's wrong is legalism. What's wrong is trying to be justified by the law. What's wrong is putting people under the condemnation of the law. What's wrong is looking to the law as some type of tutor or mentor to bring us to the Messiah. No, we've come to the Messiah. But when it's used rightly, not just to convict the lost, but rightly by believers, it's enriching and positive and powerful.
And so a lot of times our theological systems don't really include anything having to do with, the relationship that you're talking about here. How would you, I guess, if you had a new believer and you want to start them off thinking about this rightly, how would you include that? And I'm not necessarily pushing for, hey, learn this theological system or this theological system, but just giving them a full biblical understanding of the relationship that you're talking about here.
Yeah, I would just tell them that you're living in the third story of the house, so you need to rightly understand the first story and the second story. That this is part of an ongoing process building. Here's a book. You're going to dive in chapter 7, but I want you to understand what happens in chapters 1 through 6 because that lays the foundation. So even though some things were just for ancient Israel that do not apply to today, and some things can't apply because of the scattering of the people and no temple and so on, that doesn't mean that they're unimportant. So I would encourage a new believer to start read the Old Testament and the New Testament. Read some chapters from the New Testament each day, read some chapters from the Old Testament, if they can do that, or just have them start it in Genesis, reading there, but give them some good spiritual meat from the New Testament on a regular basis, but let them understand the process of where they're going. And I have no problem. I know when the Bible's translated in foreign countries and dispersed peoples and things like that are discovered, that they may just translate the Gospel of John, and that's all they have for a while. They're certainly going to translate the New Testament before they translate, say, Chronicles, something like that. And it should be like that. So by all means, we want someone first and foremost to be cultivating a relationship with God, coming to know who Jesus is, walking intimately with the Lord, turning away from sinful habits and lifestyle, being a productive disciple, making disciples, sharing their faith. The basics, we major on that. But we don't just want it hanging in the air. Give the foundation and let it be understood that the foundation is holy and beautiful as well. It's almost like looking at family history and family heritage. Yeah. Even if, this is how great-grandpa lived in the old country. We don't live like that now, but there's a lot we can learn from great-grandpa and wisdom and understanding and foundations he had that help make us who we are today. And then I tell them to read some of my books.
And I would say so too. And it's tricky because, Jew is both refers to an ethnicity and a world religion. So if I say I'm a Jew, am I in trouble? As a Gentile believer, how should I refer to myself, I suppose?
Yeah, you're in big trouble, actually. We have drones everywhere just watching for people who dare say that. We control the entire world, as you know. We control all the economy and the military and the Vatican as well.
Oh, man, that is funny.
It's best to identify yourself as being in Jesus, right? That's our ultimate identity, in Christ, in Messiah, in Him. And when it says there's neither Jew nor Gentile in Galatians and Colossians, it also says there's neither male nor female. There's neither slave nor free. A traditional Jew gets up in the morning and a man begins his day by thanking God that he's not a woman, that he's not a slave, that he's not a Gentile. Why? Because slaves can't keep all the commandments because they're slaves. Women are not obligated to keep all the commandments because of certain time-related, life cycle-related things where they couldn't keep them. Mm-hmm. And then a Gentile is not obligated to keep them. So only a Jewish male is obligated to keep all the commandments. To a traditional Jew, that's the highest honor, that's the highest calling. It's wonderful. They're thankful for it. Most Christians would look at it as a terrible burden. A traditional Jew thinks it's a wonderful privilege. Paul counters that mentality. And he says, no, in the Messiah, there's no Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, male or female. But we know there's still men and women. We still have in your building there'll probably be a men's room and a women's room, When Paul teaches Timothy and he says, okay, now look, here's how you deal with women, here issues for women, here issues for men. He talks about slaves free, but what it means is in Jesus, there's no caste system, there's no class system, there's no higher, lower, better. We're all one in the Messiah. But even if you thought of yourself as a spiritual Jew, it's really not the most accurate way to think of yourself. I'm a Jewish believer in Jesus, you're a Gentile believer in Jesus, and just like you're black, I'm white, that's part of who we are, we have heritage, we bring that all into the body. Let's bring our diversity. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 7, if you're circumcised, don't become uncircumcised. If you're uncircumcised, don't become circumcised. Let's be who we are, and in our diversity, let's demonstrate unity. And let those who bring a dimension of Jewishness and those who bring a dimension from their nation or ethnicity, we bring it together. The only difference is there is a Jewish history that precedes quote, church history that we dare not forget.
Sure. And I'm sure you shocked a lot of your radio listeners when you said you're white, given that over the radio. I know a lot of people have thought that you were a black man, actually.
But, yeah, actually, it happened. I was surprised to hear that. In fact, I got a few calls in a few days where everyone said, I thought you were black. I thought you were black. Well, it was sweet to me because I often address controversial issues.
Yeah.
And I was addressing some of my differences with President Obama, trying to overcome the idea that it's racial or so on. And I hit on really sensitive issues for a few weeks. And I knew it was getting some folks upset. And when afterwards I found out a lot of listeners thought I was black, that was encouraging to me because it meant that I came from a perspective that was outside or hostile.
Right, absolutely, totally.
Yeah. But that being said, I'm not trying to be black. So you don't have to try to be a Jew, all right?
Deal.
Right.
So in addition to, reading the books that you have, like Our Hands Are Stained with Blood, Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus, which is a wonderful book.
Well, hang on.
Yep.
It's 5 volumes. It's not one book.
Yes, 5 volumes. I'm sorry. There's 5 volumes, yes. And by the way, are any of those in audiobook format? Because
not audio. I mean, most everything is on Kindle or Nook, things like that for e-readers.
That's fair.
Yeah, but not on audio yet, to my knowledge.
That's all right. We'll work on it. And I would say, practically, what steps do we take to? I don't know if reclaim would be proper. Perhaps realize our Jewish roots, in our churches and homes and such. But what would be like? Yeah. Yeah.
Let me say this, and that'll have to be, I think, my last answer.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's a delight.
That was actually my last. Yeah, thank you. That was my last question. Okay. So perfect.
And it's probably billions by now. By the hour, it's probably gone from millions to billions of viewers.
6.2 actually, more than the Gangnam Style video. We're up there, man.
Oh, okay. We gotta pass that. But anyway, here's what's helpful. Look back to the biblical calendar. That never got displaced. Okay, there's prophetic significance to it. Passover tying with Messiah's death, first fruits with his resurrection, Pentecost, Shavuot with the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, and then trumpets with his return, Day of Atonement with national cleansing for Israel, tabernacles with the end time ingathering of Gentiles. And it's clearly laid out. New Testament makes reference to most of those. The other images we can see clearly studying the Hebrew Scriptures. But if folks started to pay attention to the calendar and understood that Easter should be celebrated as part of the larger Passover season, if they started to recognize that the second coming we're looking for, when he comes with the sound of a trumpet, according to Matthew 24 and 1 Thessalonians 4 and 1 Corinthians 15 and Revelation, the 11th chapter, and so on. Wait, that's biblical calendar. That's why trumpets, it ties in there. And then recognize also that we each need each other, that each side needs each other. It was through the Jewish witness and the Jewish Messiah that salvation comes to the nations. Now it's through the nations praying for Israel and loving Israel that Israel comes back to faith. And Paul says it's going to be riches, it's going to be beyond riches for the world. It's going to be life from the dead. So this mutual need for one another. And then even recognizing, hey, this is the older brother who's been alienated in certain ways. Even recognizing that there are a few 100,000 Jewish believers in Jesus all around the world, get to know them, get to understand them. Maybe there's a Messianic congregation in the city that loves Yeshua and preaches him. Do a joint Passover event. And one last thing, it's important to prioritize Jewish evangelism. Romans 1:16 still remains true. And Paul even writes in Romans 15 to Gentile believers that as they've received of the spiritual riches of the Jewish people, they should help Jewish believers financially. So that doesn't mean just give to some secular Zionist organization, but help those in Jewish ministry and sow into believers in the land of Israel. And those are things that just build that solidarity because we each need each other. And there's no way that the Jewish people are going to be saved in mass without the prayers and the love and the faithful witness of the church as a whole.
And by the way, for those of you who are listening, please support his ministry. I mean, goodness gracious, he is amazing, as obviously you can tell, just with the wisdom and teaching that he has. And I just wanted to ask you, Dr. Brown, how can we be praying for you, by the way?
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. Thanks. Again, the website is askdrbrown.org, and every week we're posting several new articles, several new videos, several new audios. So folks just check in there every day and click on latest article, latest blog, latest video. There's always stuff there. If they go there now and click on latest video, there's one we recorded during my radio show a few days ago, where I really give a slice of my heart about Jesus' revolution. But if folks would just pray for me and my wife Nancy and our team, that we would really get hold of the Lord like never before.
Sure.
That we would really be full of the Spirit and eyes on Jesus, everything else will fall into place. Because of what we're doing with our national radio show, we're about to launch an apologetics TV show in July on the NRB TV network. So anyone, for example, with DirecTV will get that. We're starting with a 32-week series on answering Jewish objections to Jesus.
Awesome.
There's a lot that's happening. The biggest thing is, if we, in the midst of the busyness, are really just taking hold of the Lord afresh, then the finances will come and the provision will come and everything else will come. And the warfare and all that will be no problem because of God's grace.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brown. I am humbled to just be able to talk with you, and I've grown so much just from hearing you. I posted the links and stuff like that, and everyone who watched, thank you again. Sorry for the hiccups in the beginning, but I said something awkward on the way out last time, so I'll say the same thing.